Afternoon, everyone. On behalf of FIU's Tropical Conservation at the Institute of Environment, it is my pleasure to welcome you to the sixth webinar in the series Wildlife in a Changed World. My name is Cristina Gomez. I'm the Assistant Director of the Tropical Conservation Institute, and I'm going to be moderating today's webinar. It's my pleasure to welcome our panelists, Dr. Gladys Kalema-Sukusoka, Dr. Winnie Kidu, Dr. Inza Kone, and Dr. Lila Haza. Thank you all for joining us today. As always, we're going to be taking a few questions at the end, so please use the Q&A chat at the bottom of your screen to post any questions that you might have throughout the webinar, and we'll do our best to answer as many questions as possible. Our first invited speaker today is Dr. Gladys Kalema-Sukusoka. She's the founder and CEO of the award-winning NGO and nonprofit founded in 2003 called Conservation Through Public Health. CTPH, as it's also known, primarily works to protect endangered gorillas and educate the population about the One Health concept. Gladys holds a veterinary degree from the Royal Veterinary College at the University of London and a master's in specialized veterinary medicine from North Carolina State University. After completing her studies, Gladys established Uganda Wildlife Authority's first veterinary department. She is also currently on the Leadership Council of Women for the Environment in Africa, We Africa. Gladys is a National Geographic Explorer, an Ashoka Fellow, and Mulago Foundation Henry Arnhold Fellow, and has won numerous awards for her work, including the 2009 Whitley Gold Award, the 2011 Wings Women of Discovery and Exploration Humanity Award, the 2017 President of Uganda's Golden Jubilee Award, among others. It's also my pleasure to welcome Dr. Winnie Kidu, the founder of CHD Conservation Kenya, and a senior technical advisor to the Elephant Protection Initiative Foundation. Winnie holds a PhD in biodiversity management with a focus on elephant conservation and management. She is a former trustee of the Kenya Wildlife Service and has recently been appointed by the Kenya government to the inaugural board of trustees of the Kenya Wildlife Research and Training Institute. She's a trustee of the Amboseli Trust for Elephants in Kenya and a member of the African Elephant Specialist Group. Winnie is also a founding member of We Africa. Dr. Inza Kone is also joining us today. He is a full professor of conservation biology at the University Félix Houphouët-Boigny and managing director of the Centre Suisse de Recherche Scientifique in Abidjan, Côte d'Ivoire. His work focuses on the management of natural resources and the conservation of large mammal species, particularly primates. He is the president of the African Primatological Society, co-vice chair of the Africa section of the IUCN Primate Specialist Group, and serves several committees of the International Primatological Society. He has over 100 publications in primatology, conservation, behavioral ecology, and environmental education, and has won several prestigious international awards for his work in conservation. Finally, I would like to welcome Dr. Lila Haza, the Executive Director and co-founder of Lion Guardians. Lila obtained her MS and PhD from the University of Wisconsin-Madison and is an affiliate faculty member at Colorado State University and the University of Cape Town. She is also a director and founding member of We Africa and Pride Lion Conservation Alliance. She has been recognized for her groundbreaking work through numerous awards, including CNN Heroes, the Future for Nature Award, the Young Women Conservation Biology Award, among others. Welcome, everybody. So today we're going to be talking about conservation in Africa and how it's been affected by our current crisis. When the pandemic began several months ago, many in the conservation community believed some positive could result from this, as we saw China revise the wildlife trade laws and the world seemed to finally grasp the devastating impact that the wildlife industry and human encroachment in wildlife habitat could potentially have on public health. Unfortunately, we've seen most of that hope fade, as now the economic crisis has led to an increase in poaching, a decrease in tourism, and in many cases, a decrease in surveillance, which is putting wildlife and many conservation efforts at risk. In addition, travel bans have put lots of pressure on local NGOs who have had to adapt to this new landscape. One of the major challenges for us at the Tropical Conservation Institute, for example, are related to our inability to travel to the field and do the day-to-day work on the ground that we usually would be doing this time of the year with wildlife. Thus, we've had to rely more on our local partners who have had to assume the burden of filling the gaps left by many of international players like us. besides dealing, of course, with the many other issues that have resulted from the pandemic, like increased poaching. So this has led us at TCI to reflect on our role as international players, the value and role of local partners, and on the importance of building in-country programs that are more efficient and self-reliant, and that are not so vulnerable to these types of crises that will obviously continue to happen as we move forward into the Anthropocene era. So considering the enormous challenges that local conservation organizations are currently facing with increased financial uncertainty, increased challenges, and decreased on-the-ground international support, it seems imperative to hear from local players like our panelists today to understand their current situation and together rethink our conservation strategies. So my first question today is for Winnie and Inza, and I'd like to know from you guys, how has wildlife and your work in Kenya and Cote d'Ivoire respectively been affected by the pandemic? How have your priorities changed, if at all, with these new circumstances? So Winnie.
Thank you very much. It's an absolute pleasure being part of this panel and just seeing women that I respect a lot, and Inza, you're included. Thank you very much. It's wonderful to be here. So indeed, working in so many different spheres, from the grassroots with CHD Conservation Kenya, and also working at continental level with the Elephant Protection Initiative, and being very passionate about nurturing women in conservation leadership. All these different hats have given me different perspectives on how the pandemic has affected wildlife conservation work, and of course our priorities. I'm going to start with the good news. With the absence of tourism activity in some of our national parks, and I will focus on Amboseli National Park in Kenya, which is in Southwest Kenya, things have been great. The wildlife is thriving. We've had a baby boom this year. The good rains that we experienced in 2018 and 2019 were a real gift for the females because the matings were successful and they were able to carry babies to term. Elephants carry babies for 22 months. So a good year is good for elephants. The gift of COVID, of course, is that the park is so peaceful and the families with babies are spending so much more time in the park. And indeed, for the first time in 48 years, 2 pairs of twins have been recorded in Amboseli. I had the privilege of spending time with the twins and their families during World Elephant Day celebrations. And I can tell you, it is an absolute gift. And it's not just the elephants that are thriving in Amboseli. We've got herds of wildebeest, zebra, giraffe all over the place. For the first time in my life, I've seen Amboseli lions basking on the Maram in the middle of the road. Well, Amboseli is such a busy national park that lions can hardly find somewhere to hide. So there are some positive things. And in Kenya, we haven't really recorded the kind of poaching that may have happened in other places. I think that some of these curfews and lockdowns and cessation of movement have meant it's a lot more difficult for poachers to operate. And while it is true that our security forces are impacted as well, it seems like we've had a lull in the poaching. So in Kenya, I know that certain other parts of Africa have had different story to tell, but we have a positive story. Now, of course, for many of us, the news of the pandemic reached us about February of this year. And it looked like a faraway problem. You know, we watched our TV screens and we were thinking about this like you think of hurricanes and tornadoes, things that happen somewhere else. We didn't really know that this was going to change our lives in such a significant way. The first case in Kenya was reported on the 13th of March and everything went crazy from there. Suddenly we were all scrambling to calculate how to live with lockdowns and travel restrictions. Some of us had to quickly send non-essential staff home, close city offices and figure out how to supply our field staff. Now, thankfully, organizations like Conservation Kenya are very lean on the ground. And for many years, we've run on empty. We don't usually have the kind of funds that big NGOs have. So we know how to operate with nothing. So all we did was cancel all meetings and trainings and focus more on public health issues and really try to rework our calendars to focus on the communities. The story was different for a bigger organization like the Elephant Protection Initiative, We've got programs all over Africa, and FaceTime is important for us. We run sensitive programs. We've got a lot of intense meetings. A lot of them have to be face-to-face. And without travel, we couldn't do that. We've tried a lot to use technology to meet with our teams, but it's not easy. It's difficult. And like you mentioned, having less empowered or strong groups on the ground has come to us as a really big challenge for us. On the positive side, of course, many of us have spent more time in place than we have ever had before. We've learned many new skills. We've learned how to use virtual communication. I've never been on so many webinars in my life, and I have learned so much from so many different people in the global community, and that's absolutely positive. But in doing this, we have all noticed something. Women are missing in these webinars. In fact, apart from this one, most webinars we have are dominated by men. And I am fired up more than ever to promote women for the environment. And I'm glad that this pandemic has not slowed us down. And we now are going to run the most amazing 12-month leadership course for women in Africa. So how has the pandemic affected us in negative ways and positive ways? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Winnie. I think this webinar as a specific, I'm the only man in this panel. So yeah, women are taking the power. To talk about how my project has been impacted by COVID-19. First of all, the project is, my main conservation project is about community empowerment for the conservation of 4 of the most endangered primates of West Africa and their habitat. This is in southeastern Cote d'Ivoire. This project, I would say, depends on many factors. You need to develop incentives, you need to build capacities, you need to organize communities to foster their commitment, and you finally need to raise awareness. But all these factors are being negatively impacted by the COVID-19 crisis. So this community empowerment process has been weakened somehow. As an illustration of this, one of the presidents of our community-based associations recently tried to resign. We convinced him to stay on board, but this implies that we organize communities again by organizing, I would say, elective general assemblies, build new boards and so on. So there was a kind of demotivation in the area, and this has been worsened by the COVID-19 crisis for many reasons. The first reason being that my teammates could not go in the field anymore because Abidjan was cut from the rest of the country. I would say our financial support also decreased a little bit, but significantly enough to, I would say, decrease our influence in the area. As a consequence of this, an increase of poaching has been reported in the area, as well as chainsaw mining. Because you will see that the project area is very close to Ghana, and only the Tanwe River, a very small river, is the border between Cote d'Ivoire and Ghana. People can cross easily from between Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire just using a canoe. And people come from Ghana into the Tanwe forest to cut trees. Like Ivorian can also, I would say, cut trees and sell planks in Ghana. We try to develop incentives by, I would say, promoting local development, but with the closure of the border between Cote d'Ivoire and Ghana, the products that communities yielded could not be sold anymore. So this is a new problem, creating another source of demotivation of local communities for our incentives. So the challenge is to find new markets for these initiatives. But before that, we need to remobilize communities to foster again their commitment towards conservation issues. We need to bring them, resume surveillance activities, awareness raising activities, so that habitat is preserved and also wildlife is preserved. So this led to a change in priorities at our level. Before COVID-19, our priority was to rediscover Miss Wadron's red colobus. This monkey has not been sighted by a scientist since 1978. The best chance to rediscover this monkey is in the Taru forest, and we've been camera trapping since last year with the hope to rediscover this monkey. This camera trapping process has yielded several amazing images of all vertebrates, arboreal vertebrates at least, but we still haven't found Miss Wadron. This was our priority. The second priority was to designate the forest, so to lead the forest designation process to an end so that it's recognized as a protected area managed by local communities. These remain priorities, of course, but the new priority is now to revitalize this community empowerment process. Unfortunately, we just received a grant from SOS, IUC and SOS Rapid Grant with co-funding from European Union. To reorganize community, build their capacities again, and resume surveillance, awareness raising, and even biomonitoring activities. By doing so, I won't forget, of course, support local alternatives. So by doing so, we hope to reverse this trend of the process being weakened, and we really hope to re-strengthen the process, because this has been cited as a successful project so far. As Christina said, we received a lot of international awards, so it's no question for us to fail because just of a small crisis. Thank you.
Thank you, Inza and Winnie. And I'd like to, I realize, Winnie, that you mentioned empowering local NGOs. And so I wanted to ask you guys about that. And this question is for the entire panel. In your opinion, has now, given the current crisis, the role of African grassroots organizations and local leaders changed as a result of what we're going through? And I'd like to start with Winnie and then move to Inza Leland.
I think that what we have realized through this pandemic is that those who are in place, the people who are there in touch with the communities, the people who are able to run the kind of programs that Inza is talking about need to be in place, that there is a serious need to develop the capacity for organizations in the grassroots that can function in total without necessarily depending on instructions from somebody who sits in a city or a country somewhere else. We need to develop the capacity to fundraise, to run programs, to report on programs, to be able to run fully. And this, one would ask, why hasn't it developed? I think there is guilt that is carried by those organizations that have for a long time been in the playing field, needing to feel that they have a top-down kind of setup where we go to the field and tell people what to do, and basically we're the ones who do all the reporting or the grant writing, and just a little money gets to the field, and that's what people have to work with. We recognize that organizations like ours that are fully present in the ground are the ones that get the least funding. They're the ones that are least able to build the capacity of their troops on the ground, and this needs to change, and we need to focus on the people. I think we have focused on programs a lot, but not realizing that those programs will only be successful if the people grow with the programs.
Yes, I fully agree. I fully agree with Winnie. What this COVID-19 led me to do was to take my responsibility as an African conservation leader to say, this is certainly an opportunity to voice conservation consent in this critical moment, because most people would be focusing on health issues, economic issues, and so on, but very few people will be talking about biodiversity conservation. And we needed to voice this issue. And we did that through, I would say, participating in several webinars at the national and international level. We even organized such a webinar as the African Parameteorological Society so that people pay more attention to, I would say, conservation issues. That is certainly the main cause of this pandemic. And solution, I would say, nature-based solutions are certainly the best ones. We also need to pay attention to the well-being of local communities who live close to, I would say, this biodiversity hotspot, because most of them are being certainly, I would say, really challenged by the situation. Winnie talked about conservation, tourism projects that have been decreasing in intensity. But beyond that, even classical projects who just bring support to alternative livelihoods have also been kind of jeopardized during the COVID-19 crisis. This is something not normal. We should keep thinking about the well-being of local communities being by their side. So going back in the field as soon as possible, being present there. And for this, we really need to take our responsibilities as local conservationists that people can feel, people can hear easily, and who can certainly keep present in their countries, in their respective countries over the long term. We need to give the example by trying to find solutions to our own challenges. We have to, I would say, have people keep in touch as a community, as a Pan-African community or as a global community. We need to keep in touch through technological tools like webinars. So yeah, this is what I would say the COVID-19 crisis inspired to me as a sense of responsibility.
Thanks. I'll jump in here. I'm really honored to be here amongst all of you. It's really nice. And Christina and Paul, thanks for putting this together. In terms of the role, how has the role of grassroots organizations changed? I think it's less about how they've changed and more about how the pandemic has highlighted our critical role in conservation. So a couple of examples. So I would say many African countries, and especially in Kenya, the Kenyan Wildlife Service, they started to label our work as an essential service, which pretty much means that supporting communities and wildlife are seen as vitally important, and it can't be stopped or paused during this pandemic. And never before has the conservation sector been deemed as essential. So usually it's, special classes that are are often given those things like education, but never the environment. So that's pretty huge. I think also, secondly, the pandemic, has illustrated why grassroots organizations are so important. So we've built up incredible resilience over the years, whether we're dealing with frequent droughts, political insecurity, or fighting fires. Like right now, my entire team is out fighting a fire, and that's why I've been trying to check my phone to make sure that everybody's okay, because a fire has just taken over and is about to tear down a community. Can't move livestock that rapidly. It's a big problem. So we're dealing with things like this all the time. So we know how to weather the storm, and we often come out stronger and more determined than we were before. So that kind of pattern of turning crisis into an opportunity, I think it's part of our DNA. And of course, it does help that most of us are small enough to be nimble, adaptive when times, call for quick decisions. That ultimately allows us to have bigger impact on the ground. And of course, members of our team come directly from the communities where we work. So for example, at Lion Guardians, about 99% of our entire team are Maasai from the community. So they're not gonna go anywhere. And so this is unlike the big NGOs who are really top heavy, especially at that leadership level, where you have many expats that have left the country during this pandemic. So they're facing pretty serious decision-making challenges at that level. And they're just not present on the ground right now. So I think the pandemic has really brought out the things that we have known for a long time, but it was hard for us to kind of argue those things, but now it's very visible. So, conservation is about connecting with people. It's a human issue. You actually have to be physically present to have that immediate conservation impact. And so that's why grassroots organizations are absolutely essential to the future of wildlife. I think that Gladys will agree with me, but let's see.
Well, yeah, thanks, Leila, Inza, Winnie. And just to add on to all that you're saying, I think COVID-19 has shown how, we need to really build the capacity of the local actors or the people who are from the organizations that are founded from these countries. And during this time, for example, during the COVID-19 pandemic, because our NGO, Conservation Through Public Health, does both conservation work and public health work, we've been together with the Uganda Wildlife Authority, with the only two conservation organizations that are sitting on the COVID-19 task force for the Ministry of Health. And they have taken us very seriously because we've been engaging with them for a long time. And because we are local, we're a local NGO based in Uganda. And in the process, we have been able to guide the government, even the whole country's response to COVID-19, and even issues such as, opening up for, tourism to the great apes to minimize disease transmission between people and the great apes. They've looked to groups like ours to try and guide on the best way to move forward on these issues. And so, for example, the primate tourism has been delayed. Other tourism started, but primate tourism delayed because the president of Uganda himself said we shouldn't make our cousins, the gorillas and chimpanzees, sick. So he delayed to open up great ape tourism. So the COVID-19 pandemic has also brought together, for example, there's an Africa Civil Society Organization network, which is connected to the biodiversity, the Convention of Biodiversity Alliance. And it's a group that came up and started to grow starting in February this year. The conference couldn't be held because of the COVID-19, but we all started to get together and start to grow this movement. And within this movement, we started talking about how we are, we help the government to train park staff not to put on masks, which is a big thing. Now everyone wears masks to the great apes, social distancing, hand hygiene, all of that. And now we're developing a policy for all African governments to be able to do this wherever great apes are found, and tourism is going to continue, or people are going to have close interaction with great apes, like in research sites. So I think the pandemic has brought together local actors to act in a big way to get things done. And hopefully this will lead to more funding for local grassroots organizations. Because as Leila mentioned, we're nimble, we don't require a lot to enable us to move and have a huge impact. So I think the pandemic has shown that we have to maximize resources and make the most of what we have.
Thank you, everyone. And I find it very interesting and that all the work that you guys have been able to do during this time, it seems that you have been able to address the issues that you have been confronted with. And one of the things that you mentioned, Winnie, that I find very interesting is that you said that funding is one of the big problems, that usually funding goes to the top players and very little of it gets down to the on the ground smaller grassroots NGOs, and also about focusing on the people. And so I wanted to know if you have any comments on how could we address these issues of getting funding down to the NGO, to the smaller grassroots NGOs, and how can we focus on the people? Is there anything that you guys can think that we could do to address that problem?
I think there's 2 points to this. I think that it's really important that we think about how we can all kind of pull up our sleeves and support both the communities and the wildlife that they're living with. So, I think that I do want to talk about funders, but I think it's important to just mention the big NGOs, the big international NGOs, because right now it's such an interesting time. So those big NGOs, they have the ability to raise huge sums of funding. but are often, and unfortunately, probably right now, they're not able to deliver on the ground where it's needed most. So I would love to see those big NGOs partnering with grassroots organizations, like 1, 2, 3 of them, to help provide financial and other types of support to allow them to execute on the ground. Now then it's a win-win for everyone. So the local NGOs can focus on doing their everyday work instead of spending huge amounts of time fundraising, which is not often our skill set, and nor are we interested in it. So that's kind of one aspect. And the other thing is that, you know, in terms of the role of a funder, you know, this is something I frequently think about and talk to other people about. And I think funders hold a lot of power. And with that power comes opportunity and perhaps also responsibility. So, you know, investors are undoubtedly looking for a good return on investment. So they want to know that their financial support is resulting in strong, lasting impact. So, you know, what are some of the main, you know, contributors to on-the-ground conservation impact that is sustainable? Well, first, we need strong leaders on the ground running organizations that embrace values that amplify impact, right? So that's why leadership is so important. So those are things like inclusion and diversity, compassion, and of course, collaboration. So if we want these organizations to last and actually be sustainable, then they need to be led by Africans themselves. So maybe it's time to have that crucial conversation about changing the profile of what a conservationist is or has been for the last 100 years. So it's 2020, and the old school stereotype of a white man running a conservation organization in Africa is completely outdated. And it is unlikely to give the funder the return on investment that they are hoping to have, right? And secondly, I think funders' expectations on reporting could be linked to specific outcomes. So for example, you know, part of the impact metrics or sustainability profile should be requiring a certain level of local capacity building into leadership positions. And they're not the low to middle level positions, because it's at the CEO director positions where change really happens. So, you know, Christina, I'm not sure if there's a webinar notes that will be posted after this conversation, but a colleague and a courageous conservationist from Zimbabwe, More Angels, Mbiza, just did an incredible PowerPoint the other day, which really exemplified why we need more African leaders in the conservation space. So I'd love to send you that link and we can post it so others can see that as well.
Absolutely, please do so. And I'll put it on our website so that everyone can access it. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, go ahead, Winnie. I know that you're dying to say something here.
I think that when we talk about funding, we often think about funding coming from international organizations, but remember, we also have government funding that goes into conservation programs. And in Kenya, what we've seen now during COVID is something very new, that the Kenya government has, through, of course, the efforts of our very, very positive and engaged cabinet secretary, has actually started to think about what does it actually cost to run conservation. And we have seen during the stimulus packages that have been developed during the COVID time, money has actually been directed to conservation organizations, and particularly the community conservation organizations. Now, the realization by government that they need to put the money in conservation and where the people are is a good place to start. And I think international funders need to start smelling the coffee, need to start looking, because if government is seeing that to put money directly into communities is the way to go, I think any international funder coming into Kenya, I'm not saying they change the recipients of their funding straight away, but we need to look at why don't these grassroots organizations access this funding? The structure, for instance, of how to apply for some of these grants is you need to go back to school and write a PhD in grant writing to be able to access some of this money. It's like the grant application process is made so difficult that I feel like I need to go back to school just to go through the initial concept and then the log frames and all the stuff. And meanwhile, elephants are dying and I'm battling with log frames. I mean, you know, there is a whole conversation that needs to be held about how do you lock out organizations that are essentially African from getting this money. What many of the international NGOs have done is created an excellent fundraising machinery that even has certain conversations that may not necessarily be representative of what is important for the African person. They represent what's important for the Western person that's going to give the money. And a lot of times you go for this fundraising meetings and you feel misrepresented. And then you suddenly realize, oh, it's not about me because I'm not gonna give the money and I'm not even going to get it. I'm just the person in the room that makes it look like the money is coming to the real issue on the ground. But really, I'm sitting there and I'm thinking, I'm being misrepresented here and I'm quite capable of talking about what my issues are. So there's an education, there's a rethinking of how funding is given or how funding is made available that needs to happen. And I agree with Lila that even in terms of measuring impact of that funding, it's important to develop a matrix that checks the real impact on the ground, as opposed to money that just goes to funding huge houses for expats. Fewer guzzlers for expatriates. Just a life that nobody wants to walk away from. And that's why you don't develop capacity, because the life you get doing this stuff, you don't want to walk away from. And so it's important to really, really spend some time thinking about, where do you want to make impact? Does it have to be that difficult? Is it that hard? Does it have to be that hard to really get a grant that could make a difference? And I certainly think that even as we speak about building capacity on this end, we need to have a rethink by funding organizations about why don't these African organizations apply for the funds? I mean, you need a whole year to figure out the concept. You need another whole year to figure out the log frame. And then you need another whole year to report on the $100,000 you got, so you can get another 100. It's like, hey, elephants are dying as we are doing this. And while it is great and it's important to have systems that require a certain amount of reporting, I think there's a conversation to be had. How hard should this be? I think that for some of us, we have seen a certain leaning towards a Western education that you require to access funding, and yet these animals are in Africa. Hey, I think we need to think some other way.
Really, just to add on to what Winnie and Leila have said, and also the whole point of more efficient use of the funding, international organizations teaming up more with the local organizations. It's easier for local organizations to reach communities at the grassroots level. And like right now with COVID-19, with lockdowns all over the world, we need to engage those people. What was not considered an essential service at the beginning of the pandemic, which was like, we were supposed to have a meeting with reform poachers, and we thought this is not essential, and we didn't get permission to do it. And then after we started getting acceleration of poaching due to COVID-19, which even led to the killing of a gorilla by a hungry poacher, we realized that, hey, we now need to, it's now become an essential service. And it's easier for local groups to get out there and reach these people, engage them, which we started to do recently, and tell them not to go back to poach. How can we help you to have something, to address your hunger so you don't have to enter the forest to poach? So the more that we're seeing more efficient, funding going down, international funders supporting maybe international NGOs or local NGOs directly, but stronger partnerships is really what's needed, and what we've actually seen it happening, actually. The NGOs that work, especially around the gorilla park, are working much more closely together as a result of the pandemic. And it would be good if this can continue everywhere, because that's the only way that we can all move together with all our different strengths They're good at fundraising, we're good at implementing. And there's a way that we need to get together and really get things moving in the right direction.
Yeah, very quickly, in one or two sentences, I think everything has been said. Yes, indeed, we need people in the field. There are some grassroots organizations that can be competitive for, I would say, large grants. But indeed, these are very few. This is the reality. And I think Lila suggested that big international NGOs try to develop projects in collaboration with small grassroots organizations. Some people would say, yeah, but this is like these small organizations are working for big NGOs, but this should not be the case, especially if, I would say, a capacity building component is included in the project. This is the direction to go. So you can indeed develop collaboration with somebody who is not at the same level as you, but if you build the capacity of this person, you, I would say, prepare something for the future where this person or this institution can be more competitive. Thank you.
Thank you. So I think it's clear that what you guys are saying is that bigger NGOs, international NGOs should be taking control of fundraising while you guys on the ground are doing the hands-on work and receiving that funding so that it's funneling down all the way to you. And so I wanted to know if there's anything else that you would like to add in terms of how can we relay this message to funders? Because the way that it's structured right now, it's very difficult to be able to accomplish that. So, of course, collaboration between big NGOs and between big NGOs and small grassroots organizations is a must, and it's something that we definitely have to push forward. But then, how can we get funders to realize this need and to implement it as part of the requirements of a program? Is there any suggestions on that before we move forward to the next question?
Yeah, I think conversations like what we're having are absolutely crucial, because you cannot take it for granted that, everybody's doing their best where they are. And sometimes there's just a gap in information and even realizing where this whole conversation is going. For many funding organizations, there's a lot of support for African conservation from philanthropists, impact investors, and just that individual who gives up their money and puts it through some of these organizations. And I think that African conservation has benefited hugely. At least I know that in Kenya, there's been a lot of funding flows coming through. I think it's important to recognize that this is a dynamic environment and there's a huge amount of money going through this pipeline, but we are constantly required to think and rethink about the ways in which we create impact. And I think this kind of conversations help. But I want to also put on the table something else, that remember that in Africa, we also have the ability to generate resources. We also have the ability to generate funding. Tourism has been a big funding opportunity for conservation for a long time. And in fact, many of our wildlife organizations are really feeling the bite now, with tourism having literally ceased because of COVID-19. Many of them are having serious budgetary issues. And this then has got us to a new conversation about diversifying our funding sources. Because the truth is, tourism does not have to be the only way in which conservation programs can be funded. And doesn't have to be the only way that communities can remain properly resourced. I think that there is a conversation there on diversifying livelihoods and the way we organize the spaces in which we live, that needs to be had. And maybe some of the funding needs to go more into long-term issues such as land use planning, enhanced livelihoods, just looking at the way communities that live in good coexistence with wildlife, like the pastoralists, how do you maintain that livelihood and make sure that it's not overtaken by others that will bring them into direct conflict? So I think that this funding conversation cannot just stop at the international level. I think that even locally, there is a lot of responsible reorganization that needs to happen. And there's a huge conversation there on the role of tourism and how much it has blinded us to the many other opportunities that are available. And that blindness has hit even funding organizations that run on very short funding cycles that may not be able to make the long-term impact that could change livelihoods sustainably for communities. So there is a conversation there that needs to be held about exactly how, moving forward, do we really focus on what matters? And how do we reorganize the way communities live and interact with wildlife so that their livelihoods are sustainable and are not just dependent on the fickle tourism industry, which we love and appreciate, but recognize that it can just stop. And this is what we are faced with right now, that today, an old lady next to Amboseli National Park comes up to me and says, just buy any of the ornaments, just buy anything. We haven't had anything to eat for days. And I'm asking myself, like, is this necessary? Is this the way it should have been? This place is full of wealth. There are so many other things that this woman could be doing. And I think we've been blinded by tourism and have also accessed this funding conversation in a totally different way. And I don't know what my fellow panelists think, but I think that we need to rethink funding, even from the local level.
Great, thank you, Winnie. I just wanted to quickly mention that we're recording this webinar and we're going to be posting it on our website once we're done, along with some questions. And so if anybody has to log off, that's okay. We're going to go a few minutes over to be able to finish up and answer a few of our questions. So the last thing that I wanted to ask you guys before we wrap up today is, well, we've gone through the importance of the role of NGOs and funders. I wanted to know, how can we better prepare for future issues like this? What lessons have we learned? And do you have any other suggestions of important steps that we need to take to better prepare?
I'll just jump in and talk about the issue of responsible tourism. I think I touched on it earlier on in the conversation, but this policy brief that we've developed as the Africa CSO Biodiversity Network is also geared towards not only the African governments, but the donors and the tour operators, the people who bring tourists to see wildlife in Africa. They all need to buy into this whole concept of responsible tourism. You know, tread lightly. And for example, for the case of the great apes, you know, don't market people touching gorillas or chimps and tell your client, this is what you'll expect when you come to Uganda or to Rwanda or Tanzania or something like that. And so that's responsible tourism. I see it as a future, as a way forward. And it's nice to see that tourists are now demanding that they won't make these animals sick, the gorillas or chimps, when they come. And then also responsible consumption. You know, Winnie mentioned the whole issue of, you know, we have to find a way of supporting the local communities beyond tourism, because it comes and goes, it's fickle. And with COVID-19, it was basically shut down and people are starving and desperate. And we have to find other ways of supporting them. And for example, some of their products can be bought internationally. You don't actually have to come, for example, to Gwindi to see a gorilla in order to support gorilla conservation. You could actually buy products which are made by communities like crafts, which are then sent abroad, or coffee from the farmers around the park, gorilla conservation coffee. People can drink it. Luckily, during the pandemic, we tested this approach. We got a buyer in the UK because the main buyers who were tourists were not able to come. She placed 3 orders since May, because every time I've been on a webinar and said, you can support the gorillas by buying coffee from Vicky, Money Row Beans in the UK, she's made lots of sales. So, and others have talked about virtual tourism, you know, like Ian Redmond and groups like that. So there's ways that we can support the wildlife without having to actually see it, in a kind of tourism that doesn't involve visiting them or other ways of doing responsible consumption. It's just something I wanted to add. And the donors need to be educated to support such initiatives that are not dependent on tourism directly.
Yes, I agree. I agree with Gladys. And I think what we said previously would also converge in the same direction. I mean, what we need to do to be better prepared in the future is to promote local leadership, definitely. We observed that projects in which a local leadership was strong enough could continue somehow during the COVID-19 crisis. Those who were based on just foreign power was just stopped for a long while. This is critical. So we need to develop local leadership so as to be more resilient as a project. We also need to empower local communities, to involve them in, I would say, nature conservation. By doing so, we certainly increase their own resilience, because if the project is impacted somehow by a lack of funds or so, if local communities have the skills, the know-how, they will be able to continue conservation activities together with their development activities for their own well-being. And finally, all projects should also try to diversify their funding sources or funding mechanism. If you depend just on a donor like a zoo or a consortium with zoo, for instance, you may be highly impacted by a crisis like this one. And this has been the case for many zoo supported projects, because most European zoos had to stop for a long while. So this was a lack of resources for themselves. So they couldn't continue their support to, I would say, institute project conservation projects, sorry. So for me, one lesson to be learned from this crisis is that we should be aware that we'll never be prepared enough for such a crisis if we just wait for the crisis to happen and deal with its effect. We have to deal with the roots of the crisis, the roots of the problem. And it's been demonstrated that the roots of such problems are directly linked to deforestation, to poaching, and to other activities causing disturbance to, I would say, to ecosystems. So we need to work on this, be in avoidance rather than in reaction. Being in avoidance means to focus on biodiversity conservation by empowering local communities, by promoting local leadership for sustainability. Thank you.
I'll just jump in behind Inza because he keeps talking about leadership, and I feel like I want to talk about that because I think we have a leadership crisis, and I think the pandemic just highlighted it even more. You know, for a long time we've been accepting bad behavior in the conservation space. The bad behavior has become the norm, which is really unfortunate. So, you know, we need to think about, we need to be more collaborative and less competitive, because that competitive space does not allow us to have the impacts we need to really be able to save species. You know, we need to be able to share good practices and ideas openly, because right now the way that conservation is, if you have a good idea, you just keep it to yourself because you're worried about funding. But there could be another place that really needs those ideas. You know, I think that, you know, we should be able to feel validation when we do something to help others grow, rather than having our name on things to feel recognized. You know, and we need to include all ideas, opinions, regardless of age or race or gender. You know, and this is, you know, I could talk about inclusion and diversity for quite a long time, but I won't. But I do think these are all really important leadership things that hasn't been the norm in conservation. And I think we can't avoid having that conversation. You know, and I think talking about gender, this pandemic has showed us that women are absolutely outperforming men across the globe at handling the COVID crisis. So if you're looking at countries like Germany and New Zealand, like the women are just like kicking ass. Like they really are doing so well compared to most countries where men are you know, making those decisions. So I think the question around can women lead as well as men is not really applicable anymore. I think we need more women in leadership if we have any hope in saving our dwindling species. And, you know, to provide some kind of real data to understand this gender imbalance in conservation leadership in Africa, you know, women occupy less than 5% of the top conservation positions on the continent. And so that is why 3 years ago, we started developing, you know, this fresh, much needed initiative called We Africa Are Women for the Environment. And both Winnie and Gladys are founding members and leadership councils, you know, as part of this initiative, because, you know, we're all about trying to remedy that gender imbalance by empowering women to occupy more seats at the decision-making table. So we're providing a 12-month transformative course to support women to not only build and harness their leadership talents, but also bring other women with them. It's not about going and growing on your own or coming up the ladder by yourself. It's about bringing others with you. And so, you know, I think it's really important that we all start role modeling a different way to do conservation, and maybe starting to readjust the profile of what an impactful and successful conservation leader looks like. Because that's our opportunity. I mean, we're having this discussion as all of us, but this is an opportunity for all of us as leaders in conservation to make that change, because we need enough of us. We need the mass for change to happen. It does not happen with just one or two people doing it. It happens when all of us start moving in that direction. And so that is really exciting. And I think that is an opportunity where we can start seeing big change, the change that we need to actually see, you know, to start changing that biodiversity loss and start really having big impact on our environment.
I think one of the lessons we've learned is that the world is really a global village. We said this for a long time as if it was cliche, but it's not anymore. The coronavirus has taught us that something that starts in a small market somewhere can stop the world. And so we just need to be a lot more collaborative and listen more to one another. We need to develop more platforms like the Elephant Protection Initiative in Africa, where we speak to each other in the continent and then expand even at a global level, so that these conversations can help us to shape the narrative. I'm particularly concerned about Africa because I feel like we're constantly trying to adjust to a narrative that is shaped somewhere else, because funding always seems like the driver of all our narratives. And so one of the important things about initiatives like the EPI is just bringing to the table political leaders and making sure that they're in the conversation, because we can talk to each other as much as we like, you know, conservationists, but as long as the Minister for Finance, as long as the Minister for Tourism is not at the table when the cake is being divided, as long as the President never spends even half a minute thinking about conservation and biodiversity, we in Africa are going to continue to work on a narrative that's coming from somewhere else. So I think what this coronavirus has taught us is that we need to think outside the box as conservationists and repackage our conversation in such a way that it brings everybody to the table. It speaks to political leaders. It speaks to those people that are away from us. Like now, this conversation we're having, we have lots of people here participating. They probably are from totally different spheres of influence from what we do every day. And I think that what for me this coronavirus time has done is opened up a world that I didn't even know existed. And we need to continue this, that even post-COVID, if there's going to be a post-COVID, I hope that one of the things we're going to continue doing is collaborating, talking to each other, passing the message of conservation far and wide, because I think that this is necessary, and we can't just assume that people know what we need to do. The leadership crisis has been talked about in many, many ways, and I think that this is something that we must address and must be addressed in all spheres, from grassroots right up to political leadership and leadership of conservation organizations. Grassroots organizations, their resilience, their ability to be in touch with communities, their ability to run on empty tanks must be appreciated. And we must understand that the only reason we still have wildlife in some of these places is because communities and grassroots organizations continue functioning, even when those that think they're the ones that keep them going have long gone. There's always that man who wakes up every morning, puts together an army of guys who are just wearing their local sandals, and they go out telling the community that we must look after this wildlife. The wildlife is our heritage. The wildlife is important. We need to do what we must do. It doesn't matter that we are not getting any funding, but let's do what we need to do because it's our heritage. So with that, I think that if we continue with these conversations and not taking anybody for granted, I think wildlife has a future, and we certainly are a global community, and we cannot ignore anybody. Everybody needs to come on board. Thank you.
Thank you, Winnie. I would like to just end here because you guys have really wrapped it up nicely. We unfortunately don't have time for questions, but we are going to try to address many of your questions. We had many questions give you written answers and post them online on our website. So tci.fiu.edu. So please check in next week for answers on your questions. And I would like to once again thank everyone for tuning in on behalf of our main partner, the Rare Species Conservatory Foundation, and FIU's Tropical Conservation Institute at the Institute of Environment. I'd like to thank Winnie, Inza, Leela, and Gladys for your wonderful stories, insights, and experience with the crisis so openly and so generously. This was truly a wonderful discussion. Thank you so much. So everyone stay safe, and please check our website, tci.fiu.edu for the recording of this webinar and for answers on all the questions that you had. Thank you for tuning in. Stay safe and have a wonderful day.